Hello, everyone. I'm Ken Johnson, CTO of nVisium, and welcome to another episode of SecCast Live. As you know, we're here to talk about wearable security with David Lindner. But before I roll into introductions and hand this presentation off to David, I'd like to very briefly mention what it is we do here at nVisium. nVisium is a services and product firm dedicated solely to application security. We offer a lot of the same services that other firms offer. We just perform them very differently. We attribute this to our strong roots in the development world, and we like to think of ourselves as security engineers. For example, our remediation advice typically includes code snippets that we've tested on your code base rather than generic or templated language that often leaves developers scratching their heads. Another example is our training. Our training is language and framework specific. We avoid death by PowerPoint like the plague. We typically go bug hunting with our internally developed and purposefully vulnerable applications, and then work on code fixes with the students. So all in all, we take pretty non-traditional approaches to solving security problems. Okay, so if you have questions about our services, reach out. Otherwise, let's get rolling. Today, we'll be talking about wearable security with David Lindner. David joined nVisium recently to build our mobile and IoT security practice. David gave this presentation last week at LastCon in Austin, Texas. David's spoken at a whole host of conferences and events. He spent 6 years doing mobile research, performing services around mobile security like assessments and training, and has dug in pretty deep more recently on all things related to IoT or Internet of Things. A couple quick items to mention. You can feel free to ask questions at any time during this presentation through the software's question interface. We've also reserved some time before the end of this episode for Q&A. Additionally, this episode will be recorded and posted to seccast.com within the next 1 to 2 days. Finally, we will ask for your feedback on a survey at the end of this presentation. Please fill it out. The survey is pretty short and is what we use to improve our SecCast Live episodes. With all of that out of the way, David, I'd like to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Ken mentioned, I'm here to talk about security of wearables and kind of the IoT landscape. Give a high-level overview of what we're going to talk about. But before we get started, there is one thing I'd like to know kind of about my audience, and I'm going to launch a poll. And if you could answer that quick, and just let me know, what are you? Developer, architect, manager, lead hacker? Just so I have a quick idea of what's going on. And it looks like everyone's a lead hacker. Great. So I'll go ahead and close that here really quick, and then we can get going. Okay. So today what I want to talk about are what are wearables, the threat landscape of wearables, try to, at a high level, address some of the major issues that we're seeing with wearables, and kind of what the future brings as far as wearables and the human race. So again, this is me. I've been around for quite a while. I've been focusing primarily on mobile the last 6 or so years, but I've been doing AppSec in general for 15 plus years. Look me up on Twitter and so on. I'm not real active, but the things I do tweet are probably important. So when we're talking about wearables, there's many different categories. There's sensors. You're talking mostly fitness trackers, activity monitors, things like that. Google Glass, which was around for a little bit but is no longer, they've kind of gone down the path of the contact lens approach. We're seeing more embedded sensors within clothing, a lot used in military situations, gas pipelines, oil pipelines, things like that, medical devices. There's pills and so on that you can swallow that will gather health data, pacemakers, insulin pumps. The list goes on and on. I mean, these wearables are very small for the most part, but contain some pretty serious power and are collecting some pretty serious data. So another quick poll here. When was the first wearable created? What do you think? Don't use Google. Okay. Pretty good list here. Let's just see. So the results show this. No one thinks 2012. Well, that's probably good. So the first wearable was actually created in 1961. There were two MIT math professors, Edward Thorpe and Claude Shannon. who designed and constructed this wearable. As you can see, it doesn't look like much, but think about 1961. Computers were the size of a room, right? I mean, they were large, huge, needed some serious cooling, but they created this wearable, and this wearable was strapped to their back and also had a piece that was in their shoe. And what this wearable did is it basically helped them predict the outcome of roulette, and successfully, mind you. This is way back in 1961. So wearables aren't really new. It's just there's a whole lot more of them today. And when I say a whole lot more, I really think this is an underestimate. But they say, experts say by 2019, more than 500 million wearable devices will be used every single day. Which again, I think is probably an underestimate. Considering the number of mobile devices we have, I think there's 7.5 billion mobile subscribers in the world. So I can only see that these wearables will, quickly catch up to mobile with all the things that are being worked on with all the different organizations. So is security relevant? I mean, when evaluating the security of anything new, it's always important to think about the types of data that are going to be involved, the users. Specifically, we want to think about if that data is, personally identifiable. Is it protected health information? What other privacy concerns we might have with whatever data is involved. We also want to consider, what real-world consequences there might be to someone tampering with or maliciously attacking the devices in question. Can that have a negative impact on someone? There's a whole lot of information that these devices are collecting. Where's that data going? How's it protected? Can I attack multiple people at one time, and so on. So we'll kind of dig into that at a high level. But at first, I want to give some, high-level, real-world examples about some wearables that are around today. So Strava. So when I gave this talk last week, I asked the audience if they heard of it, and surprisingly, quite a few of them had and actually use it. So what Strava is, it's actually a website and mobile app. So yes, it's on a mobile device, but you have to wear it, if you will, for it to actually function. But it's a mobile app that tracks athletic activity through GPS and so on. It's collecting various things such as heart rate, your GPS data, length of workout, effort, calories burned, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure some of you have used, numerous wearable devices. And the thing here is people can compete against other people throughout the world, if you will. And the little crown there is King of the Mountain. So you can compete and be King of the Mountain and get notoriety and so on. But I'm sure you can kind of see where there might be an issue here, right? There's a lot of data being streamed somewhere, and that's to their website. So as you can see here, so what I did is I went out and looked at Strava.com, signed up for a free account. I don't have the mobile app, don't do anything, but all of these things popped up. And as you can see on the screen here, someone did some sort of hiking or biking or running. I can see it was around Fort Lauderdale. I can see his exact path, how long it took him, the elevation, and all of that. And this is all freely available to me. So it's interesting to think about. And security researcher Micah Hoffman, he specifically targeted Strava to see what he could get from this info. So he combined all of Strava's data that was just open, right? You just have to sign up for an account. He combined that with Google and some searching data to track down people in real life, even if their first name, their full name wasn't listed on their account. He could still track them down to where they might be at any point in time, which that in and of itself is fairly scary. I'm not a big proponent of FUD, but that's real world. That did happen, and somebody could take advantage of that. So who here uses some sort of wearable? Do you use one? I'm talking Fitbits, Fuel Bands, Apple Watch, So I'm guessing most people have used them, whether or not they consider it a wearable or not. And that's really what it is. 75% of you are using wearables, and that will only increase as we go on. So another example that's going on right now, Hilton, for instance, has hotel keys using low energy Bluetooth. And if you're a Hilton Honors member, you can download the key right to your device. Right now, they're beta testing it in, I think it's like 20 hotels across the country. Mostly major cities, mostly just the Hilton hotel, not the smaller brands and so on. But you can think where there could be some issues there, right? If someone could compromise all of that. Now, you might step back and say, is that any different than the hotel keys? Maybe not. But, we're starting to think about getting access to these from further distances. Bluetooth is, anywhere from 30 to 100 meters for the most part. There have been hacks that may extend that to 1,000 meters, if you will. But for the most part, it's a fairly close proximity type issue. Another example, which actually was brought to the forefront years and years ago with Dick Cheney, were connected pacemakers. So these things are being implanted into people every day. They're connected. They allow doctors to real-time monitor their patients that are wearing these pacemakers. The thing with these are a couple, they only use cellular, so they figured that would be a little bit better than trying to connect to Wi-Fi and so on, which is probably true. And they're only publishing data. They don't allow anyone to connect to and request data yet, right? I think that's the key, is they don't yet allow that. So right now, for the most part, they're only allowing pushing of that data to the doctors so they can review it. But I'm guessing at some point there'll be the need to have the ability to make adjustments, right? What if you want to make an adjustment remotely because your patient is no longer living in Iowa? They might have moved to Florida, for instance, and they can't afford to fly back and forth every time they need an adjustment and so on. So I could definitely see that as being something coming in the future. And recently, actually, this fit really well with my talk. So I'm guessing most of you have seen, or if not had, a Fitbit. Fitbit's been around for a while, but there was a security researcher that figured out how to hack Fitbit. And basically what it is the attacker can send an infected packet to that fitness tracker over Bluetooth, and it doesn't have to be paired, so there's no pairing needed. And it's 17 bytes of data. So all of that data is then sent to the Fitbit, and when the Fitbit then synchronizes to Fitbit servers or the parent device, whether it's a mobile device, a computer, what have you, it actually sends that malicious payload to that system, whether it's like I said, your mobile device or the back-end Fitbit server. Now that's as far as she took it. So there is a step that's missing, and that's the execution step of whatever that malicious payload might be. So that would have to be further researched. But she did show and prove that this is actually fairly easy to do, to send that malicious payload of data to whatever system the Fitbit is talking to. So I'd read a little bit more about that in the upcoming days, but just know that if you're wearing a Fitbit, it's definitely not the most secure thing right now. And I don't think Fitbit has responded as far as fixing it or even knowing what the issue is. I'm hoping it's a software issue, because if it's a hardware issue, that's a pretty serious problem to solve with the number of Fitbits that are out there today. So obviously, as we develop this new technology, we have to step back and look at the security challenges of integrating that strong security into this new product, whatever it might be. There would be a lot of things against us, but that doesn't retract from the fact that there is a need for security. There is a lot of data being collected. Even if that data is not displayed back to the user, I always wonder what the Fitbits and the Feel Bands and the Apple Watches might be collecting outside of what they're showing me, right? There may be other data that they're collecting for no known reason that they may be using for future releases, or just to get to know their clientele a little bit more. But really, at the end of the day, wearables pose the same security hurdles, as far as trying to push them out into production. How do people perceive the security profile of the device? What is safe for them to carry around and save and so on. And then it's to the boundaries, right? Obviously, there is a lot that can be done with sensors and wearables. So it's what can we do versus what should we do type of debates and discussions that need to be had, because there are some serious privacy implications with a lot of these different wearable devices. So let's talk threat landscape just a little bit. And obviously this guy, he may be wearing wearable, but he's crazier than I am. But what's it look like? It's really no different, right? I mean, from a threat risk landscape standpoint, even in the mobile space, it just kind of refocused things, right? So obviously attackers are after data, access, control, and money, right? And at the end of the day, if that data and that group of data is worth something to them, they're going to try to get it. For instance, think about if I was able to attack Fitbit or some of the other trackables, wearables, and so on that track all this info, gather it all up and sell it to some marketer who was interested in a target market of folks that had on average over 15,000 steps a day. That's worth money. And while it may not seem much in the beginning, that's someone stealing data and selling it to someone else who you may not want to know about you being a very active person or what have you, right? So again, that's a privacy issue, but you could go further on down the road and talk about protected health data and so on, and see how that may be important for shaming or for targeting specific groups with heart issues and so on. So this data is valuable, and it does need to be protected. And there are multiple avenues of attack that I see, right? There's the device itself, so whatever that wearable might be. There are communication channels. Most of them are using very low energy type communication. Parent devices, so that could be mobile devices, it could be computers, it could be the back-end systems, it could be cellular companies and so on. And then web components and web APIs and cloud-based type infrastructures. So I would say it looks fairly close to this. At a very high level, this is kind of the wearable, communication channel, if you will. You can see there on the left side is my what looks like the Nike Fuel Band, which kind of went away, and actually there was a class action lawsuit, but we won't get into those details today. And you can see there's multiple avenues of communication. Some can communicate directly over cellular, like the pacemakers, but some need some sort of parent mobile or computer device to connect with, to sync with, and send that data somewhere else. But I think the biggest problem here is there's a whole lot of places to screw up, right? I mean, there's a lot of data being passed all over the place. There's authentication issues. There's anonymity versus needing to know who the person is issues. And as you can see, the little gray hat guy could probably insert him or herself in there fairly quickly, since everything is typically available over the airwaves, depending on the security of your communication channel. So when we talk about attacks against the device itself, the biggest possible limitation is going to be, kind of the APIs available or the, connection available. A lot of these are, USB connected. Some of them don't even have the typical connections depending on the size and complexity of the device. If the device is read and transmit only, as most of them really are, there really isn't a whole lot that an attacker is able to do with the device itself, depending on how it communicates beyond just that device. Plus the wearable itself, typically isn't known for having a significant amount of computing power, right, or storage, or access to Wi-Fi networks and so on. So it really will limit what the attacker is able to do. There's a very small victim pool, right? So I'd have to steal a bunch of these devices or target a specific person when it's probably not going to increase my motivation to do that. From my perspective, as someone who might be malicious, right, I would want more info and more data, not necessarily just a specific person. So attack against the wearable itself is fairly minimal, but really at the end of the day, you don't have to be a hacker to do it. I mean, these devices are very, lacking in complexity. They're very small computers, without any built-in protections on the device, which most of them I would say do not have built-in protections, even at a hardware level. You can read the data off of these devices. And we'll get into, trying to solve some of these issues moving forward. But just know that, either developing with, purchasing, using, what have you, these devices, that data that's on that device is compromisable, right? It's just the way that these small, tiny computers work. It's really difficult for them to, add security controls because, one, they don't want the battery to run out, right? I mean, I bought the Apple Watch, and while it's a pretty awesome piece of hardware, the fact that the battery lasts one day is difficult to fathom, right? I mean, when I was used to wearing, a Fitbit or a Jawbone or a Nike Feel Band, and it's like, oh, well, I have to recharge that every 10 to 15 days. That was a little bit shocking, but it is what it is. The more stuff that wearable can do, the more battery it needs, and so on and so forth. So that's really where the issues are with, the actual devices themselves. So what about the communication channels? This is really where the wearables have the biggest potential threat, right? I mean, these wearables, again, they're very low power, low complexity type pieces of hardware that have a very specific subset of things that needs to do. So for the most part, they're doing the very minimum, right? And a lot of them use Bluetooth. A lot of them use BLE, Bluetooth Low Energy, that was introduced in 2010 because they have low power, they need low cost, low bandwidth, everything low because, again, the battery issues. The problem is up until BLE 4.2, tools like Crackle provide the ability for attackers to grab long-term keys and perform man-in-the-middle attacks on Bluetooth connections. Now, 4.2, I'm not sure is vulnerable to the Crackle tool yet, but my guess is at some point it probably will. It's not real straightforward using Crackle. You do need to get an initial dump of that pairing, so the likelihood of it actually being successful is pretty low, unless you're going to downtown New York or some gym or whatever and pairing your device in the middle of nowhere, where someone just happens to be sniffing that initial pairing. And then Crackle is used to look at that packet capture and grab the long-term key, which then, again, can be used to sniff and perform man-in-the-middle on that Bluetooth connection. So some security issues were fixed in 4.2, but the real big issue here is that 4.2 is not available in most devices from a wearable perspective. Most of the newer mobile phones and parent side do have the ability to communicate via 4.2 because it is a software stack at that point, but a lot of the devices themselves do not. So outside of Bluetooth, there's HTTP and CoAP. CoAP is a constrained application protocol, which is very similar to HTTP. It's just for constrained devices. It's very low overhead, and it's using UDP instead of TCP. HTTP is very complex, and there is a lot of overhead and battery consumption when using that. From a wearable perspective, there's not a whole lot of CoAP yet, as most of them do use Bluetooth. But as we get more connected and there's more ability to communicate over other channels such as Wi-Fi and cellular and so on, we'll continue to see more co-op, and we'll talk about some issues with co-op as we move on. So, really, what does that mean from a attack perspective? Overall, we're talking a fairly high risk because that communication channel isn't always protected, or there are vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities in that communication channel. And from a Bluetooth perspective, it's interesting how BLE works. Both ends have to agree on the way they authenticate with each other, or they both automatically will downgrade to the next. So we'll talk about that too. I think that's a little backward from what we're used to. If we talk about TLS or HTTPS, the server for the most part controls, that communication handshake, right? But when we're talking BLE, both ends have to agree on it, or they'll just step back to the next less secure form of communication. So I think there's some things that can be fixed in Bluetooth, but obviously when we're talking communication channels, there's more than one victim, which increases motivations because there's more data available. Most of the communication channels do use the established standards like CoAP, HTTP, and BLE, and there's lots of plain text, real simple APIs. I mean, they are constrained simple devices, so for the most part the APIs are not complex and fairly easy to reverse engineer from an attacker standpoint. So where would I go? I'd go to a gym, right? I can't imagine going to a gym and just listening, sitting in the corner being the creepy dude with a computer and listening to all of the information being sent from all the wearables. I mean, I can't tell you the number of wearables that these people are probably wearing in their clothing, on their wrists, in their shoes, but there's a lot of data being collected at gyms. So, be cognizant of that. Again, understand what you're wearing, what you're developing for, and what data is important to the people that are wearing all these different wearables. So, obviously, the mobile device or the parent, for the most part, is a mobile device, is of concern, right? 5.2 million devices were lost or stolen in 2014 in the U.S. alone. So this is just the U.S. And they do this study every year, once or twice, to determine, how many were reported, right? These are just the reported ones that were lost or stolen. So any data that's on those devices is probably potentially compromised at that point. And is that important, right? How are they handling and storing and delivering data coming from our wearables? So here it's a little different, right, than like the communication channel and so on. So the likelihood is fairly medium, and it could be higher based on the number of devices lost or stolen every year, but the fact is not all those devices are using or connecting to wearables, at least not yet. But a lot of devices aren't up to date. Android specifically doesn't have a real upgrade path, even though they think they do now. It still has its own issues, as far as upgrading the Android operating system. The impact, compromised device, data, fairly small victim pool, right? So if I steal someone's mobile device, more than likely it's just their data that I have access to, which obviously will drop the overall impact of the parent mobile device being compromised. But it would allow me to potentially manipulate data or control the wearable and/or the back-end communications to whatever cloud infrastructure that mobile device might be talking with. So was there anything big in 2014? Well, of course there was. 75% year-over-year increase in U.S. mobile malware, and that's only going to continue as these mobile devices get more complex. When there are issues in versions of the OS, there seem to be plenty of mobile malware trying to attack that. 1 in 5 Android users experienced a mobile threat. I'm not sure how they determined what a mobile threat was, but that's pretty alarming to me. That again, as Android use and market share continue to evolve, I'm guessing that will go up. And then iOS has its own problems too, a 262% increase since 2011. So that being said, mobile is definitely a target, and attackers are going after it for data. They want to sell it. They don't necessarily want the device itself. I mean, the device is worth money, but $400 versus $40 million, I think I'll take the $40 million. So that's really what's going on with a lot of these mobile threats. And then attacks against the cloud provider, right? The likelihood of attacking cloud at this point is probably medium. This is really where you're going to get your data. This is where the attackers focus most of their time and energy because it's more profitable to them. But there would have to be some sort of vulnerability in cloud or the backend APIs, whatever you want to call it, for how that data is being stored, shared, and so on. And again, compromised user data, which could have tons of regulatory, legal implications depending on your industry and what sorts of data have been stolen and so on. And I think the biggest thing here, like Michael Hoffman did with Strava, is really the ability to identify and track single victims. I think that's a massive privacy concern outside of the selling data points. There's the security of the data and selling it, and then there's the privacy side, which will only continue to become more concerning as more and more is released about the different gov organizations and so on that are supposedly tracking and yada, yada, yada. But the fact is that all these other apps and devices and things, they're tracking us too, whether we know it or not. That data is available, right? So we got to think of it that way and understand where we're allowing that data to be saved. So let's talk at a high level here about how I think we should, try to address some of these issues. There's no bulletproof way to fix some of these things based on the fact that they're fairly constrained, based on the fact that they can't support some of the more security-conscious controls and protocols. But there are some things that I think can be done to at least prevent most of the issues that I've discussed. So, one, how about fixing the wearable, right? So don't store the data, and if you are storing the data, push as much of it to the central as possible and make it anonymous, right? So if someone is to steal somebody's wearable, someone stole my Fitbit, they shouldn't be able to track that data on that Fitbit back to me, right? So if they found it, in an airport, our CEO actually had an issue with his Fitbit. It was stolen from a TSA checkpoint. He was actually able to track it down, but that person wouldn't have necessarily known it was Jack's Fitbit. They just knew they had a Fitbit, right? And now if they wanted the data off of it, that data shouldn't be able to be tied to Jack, for instance. Make it anonymous. Like that data is only sent over the trusted Bluetooth connection with the mobile device, and then the mobile device and the backend APIs and cloud manage the person that data is attached to. I think the other thing too is having a poison pill or kill switch option on these devices. If it's not checking in over a certain period of time, just kill it, right? Reset it. I don't think that's going to be a pain point for most people. Most people have their mobile devices and their centrals located near them at most all times. So if they end up losing their wearable, they're probably more than happy to know that it was automatically reset because it hasn't connected in 3, 5, whatever, how many days it hasn't connected. So what about the communication channel, right? So for the most part, if you can, use BLE 4.2. Each different operating system, what have you, have different preferred terms, as you can see. In iOS, it's central and peripheral, which makes sense to me. Android client server, and then chipset manufacturers say master slave. BLE 4.2 is supported in iOS 8.2 and above, and Android 4.3 and above. But as I mentioned before, the problem is most of the peripherals do not support 4.2, and it is a software stack, so it will fall back. So iOS and Android will fall back to, the most recently supported version of the BLE protocol. And then authentication is a big deal too. So there are 4 methods of authentication in BLE 4.2. There's only 3 in 4.0 and 4.1. The one added in 4.2 was numeric comparison, which is basically a hard-coded key on the wearable device. It would come in the manufacturer's instructions of setting up and so on. So that was added in BLE 4.2. But there are 4: JustWorks, numeric comparison, passkey entry, and out-of-band. I've color-coded them from green, which would be the most secure, to red, which I wouldn't recommend using ever. So a lot of the issues here are twofold, right? It depends on the central and its preference. It depends on the wearable and its preference. And it also depends on the supporting OSs and what they can handle, right? So out-of-band, like I said, is the strongest. You can use NFC, you can use imaging, you can use a 128-bit key of some sort that someone has to type in. Passkey entry is difficult because typically the wearable would need the ability to display something, and some of these wearables we use don't have that ability, which is why numeric comparison was added. But again, those aren't as secure because those are 6 digits, and they're just padded with the rest of the 128-bit key of zeros. And JustWorks, obviously, they just pair. There's no authentication and no man-in-the-middle protections. So real high-level iOS and Android here. So iOS does support BLE Security Mode 4, which is the strongest security mode, link level enforced security with encrypted key exchange. Apple Watch and Handoff actually support the out-of-band Bluetooth authentication. I don't know, over the right there you can see that's what the Apple Watch looks like when you pair it to your mobile device, your iOS device. You just use the camera and it transfers the data back and forth to do that pairing. Unfortunately, as of now, even with iOS 9.1, there's only support for passkey or JustWorks in core Bluetooth. So if you want to use stronger authentication mechanisms, you'd have to do it outside of the provided iOS APIs, at a C device type level. Hopefully they'll provide that, since it seems like they have the ability with Apple Watch and Handoff. So hopefully those APIs will be upgraded here in the short term. And Apple does not provide access to NFC in your applications yet. So again, hopefully that's something that will come over time. Android, surprisingly, has supported out-of-band pairing via NFC for quite some time. So take a look at the document there, but it's just using the appropriate attribute when making that Bluetooth connection. So how do we fix the other ones, right? HTTP, obviously we use TLS 1.2. I'm sure some of you that are developers in the web even have that shoved down your throat daily. CoAP uses Dtls, which is like TLS, but for CoAP and at the UDP level. And if you can, use cert pinning. Now, again, these are constrained devices, so doing cert pinning and things like that typically are frowned upon because it does take quite a bit of battery. But if it is highly sensitive data, if it's protected health data or PII, that may be one of your better options. So I wasn't going to go into TLS much, but I wanted to talk about DTLS just a little bit because a lot of people haven't heard of DTLS. It's Datagram Transport Layer Security. Again, it's like TLS, but it's TLS for UDP, if you will. It does support stronger cipher suites, just like your typical TLS cipher suites would be supported. And there are 4 modes. NoSec, which means DTLS is disabled and it's just your CoAP plain text communication. Pre-shared key, which they use pre-shared keys to authenticate the endpoints, raw public key, and certificate-based. Obviously, certificate-based is going to be your strongest, but again, the stronger you get, the more battery power and problems that these constrained devices might have. However, we do recommend using Dtls, especially for your more sensitive data that's being transmitted from device to device. And then, real quick, preventing attacks against the device itself. Obviously, it's highly recommended to check out the top 10 mobile controls from OWASP. I'm a big advocate of control-based security. I think using controls and understanding where the controls need to be in your infrastructure only makes sense, and the same goes for mobile. Disconnecting from peripherals when you no longer need them is highly recommended. So if you're writing an application, only connect to those peripherals when you need data from them. Don't continually search for them and so on and so forth. And when you do need to connect to them, do it in a specific order, right? First, retrieve connected peripherals. And if you don't have any, second, retrieve known peripherals. And then third, scan. So scan is kind of the last resort where I maybe haven't set up any peripherals yet, or I need to reset up a peripheral, right? So that should rarely happen in your applications. And preventing attacks against the device goes along those lines too. Store data securely. I'm sure you've heard that before on mobile devices. If you're storing data at all, use some sort of containerization approach. Require authentication, strong authentication for your applications, and follow the OWASP mobile risks as well. I say top 9 because the 10th one, while it's a good practice, in my mind, it's not necessarily a risk in and of itself. Whereas I'd focus primarily on the top 9 and then talk about protecting the binaries once you've understood how to protect your application from the other risks. And then protecting attacks against the cloud. Again, OWASP has some information here. There's a current ongoing product or approach to the top 10 with cloud. I don't know if this has been fully approved yet, but they look fairly good. Protecting cloud infrastructures is only going to increase as more and more organizations use the cloud for all sorts of awesome stuff. I mean, Amazon Web Services just implemented an IoT layer that you can use with their cloud. So those things will start to increase. People with more homes that are connected, buildings that are connected, and so on. So getting the cloud right first is very important, even in a wearable type infrastructure. So what does the future hold? Well, I wish the Vikings would win the Super Bowl, but we'll see about that. It's about as likely as the Cubs winning the World Series. But moving forward, BYOD is really going to be WYOD, right? So instead of bring your own device, it's wear your own device. That will increase. Fitbit, the hackable Fitbit has a corporate program called Fitbit Wellness, which allows the corporations to sign up for different Fitbit programs that will allow them to hand out Fitbits to their organization. But who participates, right? Are these devices connected to corporation or BYOD parent devices? How is that managed? How is the data managed, right? Who has access to all that data? PII versus PHI, are those going to kind of all become one and the same when it comes to this sort of information that's being collected? These are all questions and things that we need to answer over the next year or so as these devices continue to proliferate our organizations. So just like smartphones, tablets, and so on, the future of wearable is apps. Apps are going to be connecting to all these different wearables. Wearables will have all sorts of APIs to distribute data. The apps will then take the data and do whatever they need to do to present you information about your health, present you information about your upcoming stays for travel, allow you to access banks, and so on. So apps are really going to drive the wearable market. and that's only going to increase over time. Authentication via biometrics, right? So what I have here is NIME. NIME is actually a little band that you can wear. It combines heart rate monitoring, and it also has a fingerprint scanner built into it. And right now, the Royal Bank of Canada is beta testing these for access to purchases on credit cards, right? So these sorts of things will continue to get better and stronger, and people will start using more and more of these, but it's only a matter of time. Data facilitated care. So this one really is going to explode. Dr. David Burkoff, he's a sports medicine physician at the University of North Carolina. He said one of the main objectives right now is to improve the continuity of care, right? So that's really what they're looking for. They want to be able to specifically diagnose someone and figure out their treatment path based on all the data they can get about that person. And also in real time monitor how that treatment is affecting whether that athlete who has been injured or just a typical healthcare patient, right? They want that real time data so they can tailor the treatment to that specific person instead of just saying, oh, well, that person has the flu, we'll just give them the typical antibiotics and so on for the flu, where with real-time health data, they may be able to tailor whatever that treatment might be. And I have Nike up here because Nike's actually working on some embedded biometric sensors and software that will help with this, specifically tied for athletes, right? So they're embedding these sensors and so on into clothing that lets their trainers and so on know exactly which muscles need more work, which ones were overworked, and so on. So this is nano level technology that they're embedding into their clothing. Stopping smoking. So this is another new one that's coming out sooner than later. It's basically what they're calling nicotine replacement therapy, or NRT. The little device you see on the left is attached to your body somewhere, and the mobile app can determine at what point you may need or have more cravings for nicotine, and it actually sends nicotine into your system based on your needs and what the app and device think you need. So while this isn't necessarily attacker friendly, I mean, I could see someone messing with a friend and giving them too much nicotine, right, which could cause problems. Breast cancer detection, great month for this, right? So, as most of you are aware, obviously breast cancer is a big deal. It's a big problem, and early detection is very important. So there's actually a couple organizations that are working on some technology to actually provide real-time scans of breasts, and that data is then sent to a doctor in real time so they can really early determine if someone needs treatment or has issues with breast cancer. So these things are really awesome, right? But again, it could open the door to issues with that PHI and so on. So other things that I see, breaches, it's inevitable. With the amount of data that is being collected with all these different wearables and being sent all over the place, being used by numerous number of applications, a breach is inevitable at some point. So us as developers and device manufacturers and so on need to be cognizant of how we're handling that data, how it's being displayed to other applications that may request it, the APIs that we've made available, the places we're storing it, all the things that we've thought about for years in the web AppSec space are now migrating and propagating into a much bigger connected world. And so we need to pay more attention to where all that data may be at any point in time. And really the big one is data mining, sharing, and regulation, right? Today, this is going on quite a bit, but it's only going to increase. The more and more data that there is, the more people want to data mine it, market it, figure out specific target markets based on certain criteria. It will be shared, aka sold, and there will be regulations on the different data that is available and that should be protected from a security and privacy concern. And that's it. I thank you for joining me today. Definitely look me up and reach out to me if you have any questions. But I will open it to questions now if there are any that the audience has. So I have a couple questions in the webinar. One is, can DTLS be recommended for web apps too? DTLS could be used for a web app as long as the web app is using CoAP. So it's definitely something that I would recommend if you are using CoAP. Moving forward, I think more and more devices and connectable pieces of hardware will be using CoAP, but I could potentially see the need or use for DTLS, maybe even at a WebSockets type level. Another question is, any approach, methodology, or good read docs for pen testing IoT? I don't have any off the top of my head. Pen testing IoT is fairly new. I do highly recommend checking out some of the new Amazon AWS IoT information. There's a lot of good info there that can provide insight into IoT and kind of the overall infrastructure and architecture, how it works, which could give you some ideas. We are continually trying to evolve our IoT practice, so we'll definitely keep looking at different ways for attacking IoT. And the last question I have in the webinar panel, at least, is any comments on CoAP versus MQTT? Not really. I mean, so MQTT is another constrained protocol. It's basically a pub-sub type of infrastructure. It's a messaging queue infrastructure, if you will. Depending on, with MQTT, you really need some sort of middleman, if you will, or proxy that controls the pub-sub. So if you're using a whole lot of little sensors, throughout the house, or different pipeline and stuff like that are all able to connect to a central location, it's probably more likely that they're going to use MQTT versus CoAP. But I don't even know if these will be, in 5 years, if these are going to be the standard. There's so many different protocols, if you will, that are being talked about. I mean, Google is kind of integrating their own with Weave and so on. So I'm not even sure how to best answer that, because I think it feels like we're in this point of just do whatever makes sense for your organization, maybe even create your own protocol, but at some point we're going to have to standardize to make it even viable to secure these infrastructures. Are there any other questions? Okay. Again, thank you for attending today, and I'll hand it back over to Ken.
It does look like there's one last question there regarding the recommended standardized tech stack for IoT.
Yes. The recommended standardized tech stack for IoT. Again, I think it gets back to what you're developing for. I think from an MQTT perspective, Mosquito is really broadly used. I mean, even with the AWS IoT infrastructure, they even recommend Mosquito, so I checked that out. But from a standpoint of what protocol to use, I kind of already went over that. And any other frameworks or languages, it really depends on where you're going. There's actually a really good test suite, and I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me. But search through GitHub. There's a test suite that kind of gives you an idea of all the different protocols and so on that are available and the different technology stacks. It's freely available to use unless you're going to use it for commercial purposes. But again, it goes through all the different technology stacks, like the MQTT, how you use it, CoAP, how you use it, with the different languages and so on. So again, I wish I could remember the name of that off the top of my head, but just search through GitHub for MQTT test suite, and I'm sure you'll probably stumble across it.
And it looks like we have another question about the API security.
Yep, and there is one more question about API security for the wearable device. So API security, I don't think is any different than the API security that we employ today, at a web services type API layer. Depending on what that API is providing access to, will determine the security level of that API, right? Do I need stronger authentication for anonymous step data, right? So a lot of that is going to be an organizational type thing. If you do have man-in-the-middle protections, some of that is prevented with that man-in-the-middle protection. But if there is some stronger controls available to you, whether it is authenticating, a second layer of authentication to get that data and information, again, it's really difficult because they are so constrained, and those APIs and the connections to those devices have to be very simple. So really architecting that well up front to determine where that control needs to be is really something I highly recommend. Again, I'm a proponent of control-based security, and it wouldn't be any different with the APIs being available on the wearables.
All right, well, thanks again, David. As a reminder, the video and slides for this episode will be sent out to everyone within the next day or two. Before we sign off, I wanted to mention that on December 2nd, we'll host an episode of SecCast Live with 5 really, really great panelists. The topic will be around how to implement security into a continuous delivery and continuous integration development practice. These panelists will consist of Neil Matado from GitHub, Jimmy Mesta of TrueCar and Invoca, James Wickett, who organized LastCon, built Gauntlet, and is a part of the rugged DevOps movement, Justin Collins, who developed the tool Brakeman for Ruby on Rails security analysis and helped build Twitter's AppSec program, and Matt Tesaro, who's instrumental within OWASP and is presented on this subject at length. Please remember to fill out that survey, and thank you for joining us.